Police cop pushes black woman into the river, but panic when she hit back. In a shocking incident that has sparked outrage across the community, a confrontation between law enforcement and a civilian took a dramatic and unexpected turn. A video capturing a police officer pushing a black woman into a river has gone viral, causing widespread condemnation and calls for justice. What unfolded next was truly surprising, as the woman, demonstrating remarkable resilience and courage, fought back, leaving the officers in a state of panic. If you are enthusiastic about this narrative, please inform us. If you appreciated the video, press 1. If not, select 0. Your feedback genuinely motivates me to collect additional uplifting and significant narratives.
Monica James, a former intelligence operative turned environmental activist, was crouched at the riverbank, focused on her work. Her face was lit only by the faint glow of a small flashlight as she collected samples of the river water and took photographs of the sludge seeping into the water. In her mid-30s, Monica had the build of someone who knew how to handle herself, a muscular frame toned by years of training, with scars hidden beneath her simple clothing. She had traded her combat boots and military equipment for civilian attire, yet her sharp, vigilant eyes and swift, deliberate movements betrayed her past. There was a cold resolve in her expression, a look honed by years of danger and survival. After leaving the intelligence service, Monica had tried to return to a normal life, but the things she had seen weighed too heavily on her. Corruption, abuse of power, the indifference of the wealthy toward the suffering of others, these were now as much a part of her worldview as the sky or the ground. Her choice to work as an activist wasn't a passion born of idealism, but a way of reclaiming control, a fight against the shadows that haunted her nights. She wanted to be a voice for those who had none, even if it meant putting herself at risk once more. Monica had been coming to the river for weeks, gathering evidence of the illegal dumping that was poisoning the town's water supply. She suspected the local authorities were involved, turning a blind eye, at best, and at worst, benefiting from lucrative deals with powerful companies in exchange for silence. Her goal was simple yet dangerous: expose the truth. But she knew that once she began to push back against these forces, there would be consequences. People like her, those who tried to shed light on the town's darkest secrets, rarely went unpunished. Tonight, her instincts told her she wasn't alone. She felt eyes on her, and though her training kept her composed, her pulse quickened. There was an unsettling silence, a quiet that felt wrong even in a place as empty and desolate as the riverbank. But Monica wasn't the type to back down. If someone was watching her, so be it. Let them see what she was doing. She had nothing to hide. Meanwhile, patrolling the darkened streets nearby was Officer Charlie Mason, a man whose presence alone was often enough to send a chill through the town. Known for his aggressive tactics and a trail of dubious arrests, Mason had gained a reputation as the kind of cop who believed in control by intimidation. A tall, imposing figure with sharp features, he walked with a permanent scowl, as though he bore some grudge against the world itself. To Mason, Riverside was a town lost to the decay of its inhabitants, making a place full of people who needed order, by force if necessary. Mason had been raised in Riverside, a product of its rougher neighborhoods. He had joined the police force young, driven by a twisted sense of duty mixed with a thirst for power. To him, the badge was not just a symbol of authority, but a weapon against those he deemed lesser. His approach to law enforcement was shaped by anger and resentment. Over time, Mason's resentment had hardened into a callousness that allowed him to view others as objects, obstacles, or threats. The local community feared him, knowing that he would bend rules and enforce his own twisted form of justice without hesitation. Tonight, Mason was in a particularly foul mood. A complaint had come in about suspicious activity by the river, and it had fallen to him to check it out. When he saw the faint light from Monica's flashlight glimmering near the riverbank, a surge of irritation and suspicion flared within him. He didn't recognize her from this distance, but her presence was enough to set him on edge. To Mason, people loitering by the river at night had only one purpose: trouble. And for a woman alone out here, he had even less patience. His mind immediately assumed the worst: an act of vandalism, perhaps, or someone trying to get rid of evidence. Approaching quietly, Mason could see her crouched near the water, gathering samples in small vials. The sight only fed into his suspicions. Who comes down to a polluted river at night if they aren't up to something? He imagined some kind of eco-terrorist or amateur journalist, someone trying to stir up issues that didn't exist. In his eyes, she was a problem that needed to be dealt with, and his idea of dealing with it rarely involved calm conversation. He clicked on his flashlight and aimed it directly at her. "Hey," his voice was harsh, more a bark than a greeting. The sudden flash of light and the loud voice would have startled most people, but Monica didn't flinch. Slowly, she stood up, keeping her movements controlled and her expression unreadable. Years of training taught her never to show weakness, especially in the face of someone seeking to intimidate her. "What are you doing out here?" Mason demanded, advancing toward her. His hand hovered near his belt, a clear signal that he was ready to escalate if necessary. The power of authority seeped into his tone, thick and overbearing, laced with the unspoken threat that he could ruin anyone's night or life if he chose to. Monica met his gaze with calm defiance, her eyes assessing him with the same unyielding stare that had unnerved opponents on battlefields far worse than this. "Just collecting samples," she replied, her voice even, giving away nothing. She didn't owe him an explanation, but she wasn't about to provoke him unnecessarily. She had dealt with men like Mason before, bullies with a badge, men who hid behind authority to mask their own insecurities and shortcomings. Mason took a step closer, narrowing the gap between them until he was nearly in her personal space. "Samples," he repeated with mocking disbelief, looking her up and down as if searching for some sign of guilt. "You think I'm going to believe that? People like you don't belong out here. This area's off limits after dark. You got some kind of ID?" Monica clenched her jaw, weighing her options. She knew there was no off-limits rule by the river at night, but she also knew this type of officer didn't care for legal nuances. Mason was itching for a confrontation, and she could sense the thrill in his eyes, a hint of excitement masked as annoyance. It was as if he was daring her to defy him. "No law says I can't be here," she replied firmly, making it clear she wasn't intimidated. "I'm gathering data on water contamination for an environmental case." Her words had the opposite effect she'd hoped for. Instead of placating him, they seemed to light a fuse. "Environmental case," he sneered, his tone dripping with disdain. "So you're one of those activists. I think you're some kind of hero coming out here and taking pictures, saving the town single-handedly." He took another step forward, this time close enough that Monica could see the disdain etched into his face, the way his jaw clenched and his eyes gleamed with a dark satisfaction. Mason's face was contorted with a mix of anger and arrogance, an expression she'd seen too many times. He didn't see her as a threat. To him, she was just another nuisance, a woman to be reminded of her place. Monica knew she was walking a fine line. This man didn't just want compliance, he wanted submission. But she couldn't back down, not when she was so close to exposing the corruption that plagued her town. And as she held his gaze, unblinking and resolute, she realized that Mason saw the same thing in her eyes, a defiance that neither intimidation nor authority could erase. The tension between Monica and Officer Mason hung heavy in the cold night air, their confrontation punctuated by the distant sounds of the industrial town settling into silence. Monica could feel the anger radiating off him, a barely restrained animosity that he struggled to contain. She'd seen men like this before, men who wielded authority as a weapon rather than a responsibility, men who took it as a personal insult if anyone challenged their power. Mason sneered, his eyes never leaving hers, daring her to defy him. He didn't care about contamination or environmental evidence. To him, Monica was just another problem that needed to be crushed. He leaned in closer, invading her space deliberately, his tone dripping with derision. "You think you're some kind of hero, don't you?" he spat. "Some eco-warrior out here to save the world? Let me tell you something, lady, this town doesn't need saving. Especially not by someone like you." Monica held her ground, refusing to step back even as his words cut through the air like knives. She knew this type of intimidation tactic all too well. This wasn't just about her presence by the river or her gathering samples, it was personal. Mason saw her confidence as a challenge and her purpose as a threat. Her refusal to bow down or show fear was enough to turn his irritation into something darker. "Look," she replied evenly, struggling to keep her voice calm, "I'm here because this river is being poisoned. People are getting sick. If you have an issue with me being here, you can take it up with my lawyer." The mention of a lawyer only seemed to inflame him further. Mason's jaw tightened, and for a brief moment, his hand moved closer to the gun at his hip. Monica's gaze flicked down to his hand, noting the twitch of his fingers, the barely contained rage in his stance. This was a man on the verge of losing control, and she knew she needed to tread carefully. "Your lawyer?" he mocked, his voice rising in a harsh, grating laugh. "You think you can just walk away from this? You're out here in the middle of the night, lurking around a contaminated river, and you want me to believe you're just collecting samples? You're trespassing, lady. That alone's enough to haul you in." Monica took a slow breath, steadying herself. "There's no law against being here," she said, keeping her tone firm. "This isn't private property, and I have every right to be here. What you're doing is harassment, officer." The word harassment seemed to strike a nerve. Mason's face twisted with anger, and he took a sudden step forward, closing the distance between them. He was so close now that she could smell the faint scent of stale coffee on his breath, see the twitch of his jaw as he ground his teeth. "You really think you can talk to me like that?" he snarled, his voice low and menacing. "I'm giving you one last chance to tell me what you're really doing here, or we're going to have a serious problem." Monica's heart pounded, but she refused to look away. "I've told you, I'm gathering evidence of contamination. If you don't believe me, that's your problem, not mine." For a moment, there was a dangerous silence. Mason's eyes bore into hers, his expression a mix of fury and contempt. Then, without warning, he grabbed her arm, his grip tight and bruising. His fingers dug into her skin with a force that made her wince, but she didn't make a sound. She dealt with worse. "Let go of me," she said coldly, her voice steady even as her pulse raced. Mason ignored her, his grip tightening as he began to drag her away from the riverbank. "I'm done listening to your excuses," he muttered. "You're coming with me." Monica twisted her arm, trying to break free, but his grip was like iron. She could feel the anger building inside her, a familiar surge of adrenaline that she hadn't felt in a long time. She knew she was strong enough to fight back, but she also knew that if she did, things could escalate beyond her control. Her training had taught her when to act and when to wait. "Let me go." Her voice was sharper now, a warning in her tone that anyone else would have heeded, but Mason was beyond reason. In his mind, she was already guilty of defiance, guilty of challenging his authority, guilty simply because she was there. He jerked her arm roughly, pulling her closer to the water's edge. She stumbled, barely catching herself before her foot slipped on the muddy bank. The river rushed below them, dark and cold, its surface rippling ominously under the faint glow of the moon. "See this?" Mason gestured angrily toward the water. "This is what happens when people like you think you can just do whatever you want. You think you can come into my town, make a mess, and walk away." Monica's patience snapped. She pulled her arm back sharply, managing to wrench herself free from his grip. She stumbled backward, catching her balance just as Mason lunged toward her, his eyes blazing with fury. "What is your problem?" she demanded, her voice steady but laced with anger. "You're the one crossing the line here, not me." But her defiance only seemed to fuel his rage. He lunged forward again, his hands reaching for her, and this time she had no choice but to react. Using the skills she'd honed over years of training, she sidestepped him, grabbing his arm and twisting it in a quick, calculated motion. Mason stumbled, his own weight throwing him off balance. For a brief, satisfying moment, Monica thought she'd managed to defuse the situation. But then, with a sudden, unexpected burst of strength, he pulled free and shoved her with all his might. The force of the shove sent her staggering backward, her feet slipping on the wet, muddy ground. She tried to catch herself, her arms flailing as she lost her footing, but it was too late. With a sickening lurch, she fell backward, her body tipping over the edge of the bank and into the freezing, polluted water below. The river swallowed her in an instant, the icy cold cutting through her clothes and seizing her muscles with a shock that stole her breath. The water was darker than she'd anticipated, murky with silt and chemicals, and as she struggled to surface, she felt the weight of the river dragging her down, pulling her deeper into its depths. But Monica was a fighter. She had faced worse, survived worse. With a determined twist, she kicked her legs, forcing herself upward. Her head broke through the surface, and she gasped for air, choking as the frigid water burned her throat. She could see the riverbank above, where Mason stood, watching her with a look of twisted satisfaction. Her heart pounded with a mix of fury and fear as she realized he had no intention of helping her. He'd pushed her in, fully expecting her to drown, to disappear into the depths of the polluted river and solve his problem for him. And for a moment, she saw him as he truly was, an empty shell of a man, consumed by his own hatred and the false sense of power his badge gave him. But Monica wasn't about to give him that satisfaction. Gritting her teeth against the cold, she forced her arms to move, swimming with steady, practiced strokes, until she reached the riverbank. Her fingers clawed into the muddy earth, and with a final burst of strength, she hauled herself out of the water, her body trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline. Mason took a step back, surprise flickering across his face as he realized she wasn't going to disappear that easily. Monica stood there, drenched and freezing, her breath coming in harsh, ragged gasps. She could see the conflict in his eyes, the dawning realization that she wasn't the type to back down or stay down. She wiped a strand of wet hair from her face, her gaze locked onto his. "Is that all you've got?" she asked, her voice dripping with defiance. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, steady anger that burned hotter than the river's chill. Mason's jaw clenched, his fists tightening as he took a step forward, as if debating whether to try again. But something in her eyes stopped him, a flicker of understanding, a momentary glimpse of the strength that lay behind her calm exterior. For the first time he hesitated, the mask of arrogance slipping just enough for her to see a shadow of uncertainty. But that moment passed as quickly as it came. His expression hardened again, and he squared his shoulders, a sneer twisting his lips. "You don't belong here," he spat, his voice filled with venom. "People like you don't belong anywhere." Monica took a slow, deliberate step toward him, her gaze unflinching. "I belong wherever I decide to be, and I'm not going anywhere." For the first time, Mason found himself at a loss for words. The woman before him was a force he hadn't anticipated, a challenge he hadn't expected. And as they stood there, locked in a silent, unyielding standoff, both of them knew this was far from over. Monica's drenched clothes clung to her skin, each movement weighed down by the frigid river water still dripping from her frame. Her heart pounded as she steadied herself on the muddy bank, fighting the shivers that racked her body. Her gaze remained fixed on Mason, whose face twisted with a mixture of contempt and something darker, a glint of satisfaction that she hadn't missed. For him, this was personal. She could see it in the way he sneered, the self-righteous arrogance in his stance as he watched her struggle to regain her footing. Monica had dealt with threats before, but something about Mason's unrestrained hostility set off every instinct she developed in her years of training. This was a man who didn't just want compliance, he wanted submission, and he'd go to any length to get it. She recognized the type all too well, men who used their power to intimidate, manipulate, and control. But she wasn't the same woman she had been before, naive to the ways of abuse cloaked in authority. Mason might have the upper hand tonight, but she wasn't about to let him think he'd won. Mason took a deliberate step forward, his shadow stretching over her like a dark omen. "You don't seem to understand the situation you're in," he sneered. "You're trespassing, tampering with evidence, hell, maybe even vandalizing. And then you have the nerve to lay hands on an officer of the law." Monica wiped a smear of mud from her cheek, unfazed by his attempt at intimidation. She didn't bother to respond, meeting his gaze with a look of unflinching defiance. She knew men like him thrived on the reactions they provoked, and she refused to give him the satisfaction. "Nothing to say." Mason pressed, his voice laced with venom. He leaned closer, his hand still hovering near his gun, as if to remind her who held the authority here. "You think you're better than me, don't you? Coming out here with your little samples, acting like you're some kind of savior." Monica let out a slow breath, steadying herself. "I'm here because people are getting sick, Mason. Because the water in this river is poisoned, and no one's doing anything about it. Least of all you." Mason's face darkened, his jaw clenching as he took another step toward her. The way he closed the distance was deliberate, aggressive, a predator cornering his prey. "Watch your tone, lady," he snarled, his hand moving dangerously close to his gun. "You think I give a damn about your little environmental crusade? You're nothing but a nuisance. And people like you don't get to come into my town and tell me how to do my job." Monica's eyes narrowed, her patience fraying as she felt the cold grip of anger tightening in her chest. "This isn't your town, Mason. It belongs to everyone who lives here. The people who are getting hurt by what's happening to this river." He scoffed, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "People like you don't get it, do you? This town's a lost cause. Has been for years. You think you're going to waltz in here and change things?" He shook his head, the disdain evident in his tone. "There's nothing here worth saving." The words cut through her, not because she believed them, but because they confirmed what she'd suspected. Mason had already written off this town and its people. To him, Riverside was a dead end, a place where he could exercise his power without consequences, where he could be judge, jury, and executioner. She could see it now, clear as day. He didn't just despise her, he despised everything she represented. Monica took a steadying breath, refusing to back down. "Maybe that's true," she said evenly. "Maybe you're right. and this town is as broken as you are. But that doesn't mean I'm going to stand by and do nothing." Something snapped in Mason's gaze, a flicker of barely restrained rage. Without warning, he lunged forward, his hand shooting out to grab her by the collar. His fingers dug into the fabric, twisting it tightly against her throat as he yanked her closer, his face inches from hers. She could feel the heat of his anger, the unyielding grip of his authority pressing down on her like a physical weight. "Listen here, you little," his words cut off as Monica's hand shot up, her fingers clamping around his wrist in a practiced hold. She twisted sharply, leveraging her weight against him, and he stumbled, caught off guard by her sudden resistance. But he quickly recovered, his face contorting with fury as he yanked his arm free and shoved her back, hard. Monica staggered, barely catching herself before her foot slipped on the muddy ground. She braced herself, her muscles tensed and ready, every instinct screaming at her to be prepared. She knew that look in his eyes, the cold, unhinged determination of a man who felt his power slipping through his fingers. "Enough games," he growled, reaching for his gun. "I'll teach you a lesson you won't forget." In an instant, Monica's training kicked in. She sidestepped, moving with a speed and precision honed by years of experience. Her hand shot out, knocking his arm aside just as his fingers closed around the grip of his gun. Mason staggered, momentarily thrown off balance, and Monica seized the opening. She twisted his wrist, forcing him to drop the gun, which landed in the mud with a heavy thud. For a brief, exhilarating moment, she thought she'd gained the upper hand. But Mason's face twisted with a savage grin, and he drove his knee up, slamming it into her stomach with brutal force. The impact stole the breath from her lungs, and she doubled over, her vision swimming as pain radiated through her body. "You really think you can take me down?" he taunted, his voice a low, mocking hiss. He grabbed her by the shoulders, forcing her upright as she struggled to regain her breath. "I've dealt with worse than you, lady. You're nothing but a pest, and I'm the exterminator." Monica's mind raced, her instincts screaming at her to fight back, to do something, anything to break free from his iron grip. But her body was weakened from the cold river, her muscles stiff and unresponsive. She was trapped, held in place by a man who saw her as nothing more than a target, a problem to be dealt with. "You're pathetic," Mason sneered, his fingers digging into her shoulders. "Coming out here, thinking you're gonna save the world. People like you never learn. You're all the same idealists with your heads in the clouds, thinking you're untouchable." She locked eyes with him, her gaze steady despite the pain. "People like me aren't afraid of people like you." The words seemed to hit a nerve, his expression twisting with rage. He shoved her back, sending her sprawling onto the ground. The impact jarred her body, mud seeping into her clothes as she struggled to push herself up. But before she could get to her feet, Mason was on her, pinning her down with his knee pressed firmly against her chest, his weight crushing her into the earth. "You really don't know when to quit, do you?" he sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "I could make you disappear right here, right now, and no one would even know. They'd just find some poor, drowned woman in the river, just another body in a town full of nobodies." Monica fought to breathe, the pressure on her chest making it impossible to draw a full breath, but she refused to look away, her gaze locked onto his with a fierce defiance that refused to die, even as her vision blurred. "Go ahead," she choked out, her voice barely a whisper. "Do it, but remember someone always knows." Mason's eyes narrowed, his jaw clenching as he pressed down harder, testing her limits. But there was something in her words that gave him pause, a sliver of doubt that wormed its way into his mind. He could see the conviction in her gaze, the unshakable resolve that defied his authority. And for the first time he felt a flicker of uncertainty, a crack in the foundation of his own confidence. With a frustrated growl he released her, pushing himself up and taking a step back. Monica lay there, gasping for air, every muscle in her body screaming in protest as she forced herself to sit up. She could see the rage in his eyes, the barely contained fury of a man who'd been denied the satisfaction he craved. But she knew this wasn't over. Not yet. Mason reached down, grabbing her by the collar and hauling her to her feet. His grip was unforgiving, his fingers digging into her skin as he leaned in close, his voice a low, menacing hiss. You think you're going to walk away from this? You think anyone's going to believe your story? Monica met his gaze, her eyes hard and unyielding. It's not a story, Mason. It's the truth. And people will believe it, whether you like it or not. For a moment they stood there, locked in a silent standoff, each daring the other to make the next move. Monica could feel the tension crackling in the air between them, a charged, dangerous energy that threatened to explode at any second. And then, without warning, Mason shoved her back, sending her stumbling toward the river's edge once more. But this time Monica was ready. She caught herself before she could fall, her body tense and alert, every muscle coiled like a spring. Mason's face twisted with frustration, his fists clenched as he realized she wasn't going to back down. She could see the conflict in his eyes, the inner battle between his desire to control her and the knowledge that she wasn't someone who could be easily subdued. You're making a mistake, he growled, his voice laced with venom. You keep pushing me and I will bury you. Don't think for a second that I won't. Monica took a slow, deliberate step forward, her gaze steady and unwavering. You've already tried, she replied coldly, and you failed. So go ahead, Mason. Take your best shot, because I'm not going anywhere. Her words hung in the air, a challenge that left no room for interpretation. She could see the fury in his eyes, the hatred that simmered beneath the surface. But beneath it, she also saw something else, a flicker of fear, a recognition that he was facing someone who wouldn't be cowed, someone who wouldn't let him win. For the first time, Mason hesitated. The realization hit him like a slap, a harsh reminder that his power wasn't absolute, that his control was slipping through his fingers like sand. And as he stared into her eyes, he knew that he was no longer in control of this situation. But Mason was nothing if not stubborn. His face twisted with renewed determination, and he took a step back, his voice a low, menacing growl. You'll regret this, James. Mark my words, you'll regret ever crossing me. And with that he turned and strode away, leaving her standing by the river, battered but unbroken, a fierce resolve burning in her eyes. The following day, Riverside was wrapped in a subdued quiet, the kind that followed a storm. It was a deceptive calm, the kind that hid fractures beneath the surface. Monica awoke with her muscles sore and bruises forming along her arms and torso, stark reminders of the previous night's encounter with Mason. As she dressed, she caught sight of herself in the mirror, a thin line of dried blood across her cheekbone, bruised knuckles, and a determined glint in her eye that told her retreat was not an option. Monica had a mission, one that couldn't be deterred by a rogue cop with a power complex. She was close to exposing the truth about the contamination in the river, the very thing that had poisoned the town over the years, the invisible toxins responsible for mysterious illnesses and, in some cases, deaths. She'd come this far, and she wasn't about to stop now, not when she had tangible evidence in her hands. After applying a basic bandage to her cheek, Monica gathered her gear, sample containers, a small digital camera, and her waterproof notebook where she kept meticulous notes. She'd already stashed away the samples she'd managed to collect before Mason's unwelcome interruption. But there was one last area she needed to examine to complete her findings, a restricted zone near the river, where waste from the local chemical plant was rumored to be dumped. Monica knew that this would be risky. The site was monitored, though sparsely, and the law enforcement was likely in cahoots with the company executives, men like Mason who viewed themselves as untouchable in this town. But if she could capture photos and collect samples from that specific spot, she'd have enough evidence to expose their entire operation. The early morning air was crisp as she made her way toward the outskirts of town, avoiding the main roads and sticking to narrow back alleys and unmarked trails through abandoned lots. She was careful, moving quietly, aware that Mason could have eyes out looking for her. She wouldn't underestimate him. If their encounter last night taught her anything, it was that he would stop at nothing to crush what he saw as a threat to his authority. After nearly an hour of navigating through derelict buildings and deserted lots, she arrived near the restricted area. Hidden behind a cluster of rusted shipping containers, she watched the facility from a distance, assessing the situation. The chemical plant loomed before her like a fortress of industrial decay, its metallic walls corroded by years of pollution and neglect. A chain-link fence, topped with razor wire, surrounded the perimeter, with faded no trespassing signs hanging every few meters. She took a slow, steady breath, tightening the strap of her camera bag and mentally reviewing her plan. The fence line extended along the river, but she'd spotted a small gap in the wire near the south end during her previous visits. If she could get through undetected, she could reach the area where the waste runoff drained into the water. It would be dangerous, but she'd dealt with worse. The truth she sought was worth the risk. As she crept closer, moving low along the shadows cast by nearby machinery, she heard the faint sound of footsteps crunching on gravel. Instinctively, Monica ducked behind a stack of oil drums, her heart racing. She listened, counting the footsteps and trying to gauge their distance. It didn't sound like multiple guards, just one. She risked a glance and caught sight of a lone figure patrolling the fence line, a bored-looking guard with a flashlight lazily sweeping the ground in front of him. The guard paused to light a cigarette, his back turned to her, and she seized the opportunity. Moving quickly but silently, she darted across the open space, slipping through the gap in the fence. She crouched low, barely breathing as the guard turned around, oblivious to her presence. She was in. Keeping to the shadows, she followed the faint trickle of contaminated water, the stench growing stronger as she neared the riverbank. Dark, oily liquid seeped from a pipe that jutted out from beneath the plant's foundation, spilling into the river in slow, toxic streams. The sight filled her with a mix of anger and disgust. This was it, the smoking gun she needed. The final piece of evidence. She carefully scooped water samples into her vials, making sure to capture the dark sludge closest to the runoff pipe. She took several photos, documenting the grotesque black stain spreading through the river, a visible scar on the once pure waters that had been the lifeblood of Riverside. As she worked, her thoughts drifted to the townspeople, the families, the children who had been unknowingly exposed to this poison. She felt the weight of her responsibility settle heavily on her shoulders. She was their last hope, the only one willing to challenge the toxic alliance between the plant, the police, and the corrupt local government. Monica was nearly finished when she heard voices, angry, hurried voices coming from the direction of the fence. Her heart skipped a beat as she recognized one of them, Mason. "You sure you saw her come this way?" Mason's voice was a sharp whisper, but the fury in his tone was unmistakable. "Yeah, boss. Got a tip that she was snooping around here last night. Figured she'd try again," another man replied, his tone eager to please. Monica clenched her jaw. Mason had anticipated her next move. She glanced around, searching for an escape route. She couldn't afford to be caught now, not with the evidence she'd just gathered. Her gaze settled on a narrow trail leading up a small embankment, partially obscured by shrubs. It would take her around the perimeter of the facility, giving her a chance to loop back toward the gap in the fence. Moving as quietly as possible, she stuffed the vials into a bag and adjusted the camera around her neck. She was just about to make a break for it when she heard Mason's voice, closer this time. "Monica," he called out, his tone laced with mockery. "I know you're out here. You really think you're going to get away with this? That anyone's going to believe your little sob story?" She swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay calm. He was trying to rattle her, to get her to reveal herself. She couldn't give him that satisfaction. She moved up the trail, each step precise and silent, keeping her breathing shallow as she neared the top of the embankment. "Come on, Monica," Mason's voice taunted, closer still. "You think you're the first person to try and play hero in this town. People like you idealists, you all have the same end. You either give up or you get put down." The last word sent a chill down her spine, but she kept moving, ducking low as she reached the top of the embankment. She stole a quick glance back and saw Mason and his lackey standing near the runoff pipe, scanning the area with flashlights. She noted the fury on Mason's face, a mix of anger and satisfaction, as though he believed she was already cornered. Monica knew this was a critical moment. She had to escape without alerting them, or everything she'd worked for would be lost. She couldn't let Mason destroy the evidence she'd gathered. Gritting her teeth, she crept along the trail, moving toward a cluster of trees that provided cover on the other side of the fence. Suddenly, a flashlight beam swept over her position, and she flattened herself against the ground, her heart pounding. The light hovered for a moment before moving on, but she knew her time was running out. She waited until she was certain they weren't looking in her direction, then bolted toward the tree line, her footsteps muffled by the damp earth. Behind her she heard a shout. "There!" By the trees. It was the other man, his voice high with excitement. She pushed herself harder, her legs burning as she sprinted through the underbrush. She could hear Mason's footsteps thundering behind her, his fury driving him forward with a relentless determination. He was faster than she'd anticipated, and she could feel him gaining on her, the gap between them closing with each step. Monica's mind raced, weighing her options. She could try to lose him in the dense woods, but she knew he was familiar with this terrain, perhaps more than she was. And if he caught her, it wouldn't just be an arrest, he'd make sure she suffered, make an example out of her to warn anyone else who dared to challenge his authority. But then, as she ducked beneath a low-hanging branch, she spotted an old maintenance shed up ahead, half hidden by a cluster of bushes. It was small, barely more than a shack, but it offered a place to regroup. She veered toward it, her lungs burning as she pushed through the last stretch and slipped inside, pressing her back against the wooden wall as she struggled to catch her breath. Outside, she heard Mason and his accomplice nearing, their voices echoing through the trees. "Split up," Mason ordered, his tone cold and unyielding. "She can't have gotten far. You find her, you hold her down until I get there." Monica held her breath, straining to listen as their footsteps faded in opposite directions. She felt a rush of relief, but she knew it was only temporary. She had to think fast, to find a way to get out of the restricted zone and back to the town without Mason or his accomplice catching her. As she scanned the shed for anything that could be of use, her eyes settled on an old, rusted wrench lying on the floor. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. She picked it up, testing its weight in her hand, before tucking it into her bag. Then she turned her attention to the small window at the back of the shed, just big enough for her to squeeze through. She climbed onto an overturned crate, carefully pushing the window open and slipping through, landing quietly on the other side. She was back on the outskirts of the facility, with the open field stretching out before her. If she could make it to the road, she'd be able to put enough distance between herself and Mason to escape. But just as she began to move, a voice rang out from behind her. "Found you." Monica spun around, her heart leaping into her throat, as she saw Mason's accomplice standing there, his flashlight trained on her. He wore a smug grin, clearly proud of himself for cornering her. Behind him, she could hear Mason's approaching footsteps, slow and steady, like the measured beats of a predator closing in on its prey. She had only seconds to react. Without thinking, she swung her bag forward, the wrench clanging against the metal inside as she held it like a makeshift weapon. The man hesitated, his grin faltering as he realized she wasn't about to go quietly. "Stay back," she warned, her voice cold and steady. But he only laughed, taking a step closer. "What are you going to do with that, sweetheart? Swing it at me." "At me?" He lunged forward, reaching for her. But she was ready. She swung the bag with all her strength, the wrench colliding with his arm with a sickening thud. He yelped, stumbling back and clutching his arm as pain twisted his face. But Monica didn't wait for him to recover. She turned and sprinted toward the road, her heart pounding as Mason's furious shout echoed behind her. "Get her!" She didn't look back, her focus fixed on the distant lights of the town as she ran. She could feel Mason's rage trailing her like a shadow, but she was faster, driven by a determination stronger than his hatred. She would escape. She would expose the truth, and she would bring down every last one of them. Monica's legs ached, her breath came in ragged gasps, and her pulse thundered in her ears as she pushed herself harder along the dark, uneven terrain. She'd managed to escape Mason's immediate reach, but she knew it was only a matter of time before he found her trail again. Her mind raced through her options, weighing each risk as she scanned her surroundings. She couldn't go to her apartment. It would be the first place they'd check. She didn't have time to reach any trusted friends or allies in town, and besides, she couldn't endanger anyone else. Her only hope was to get out of Riverside temporarily, find a secure place to stash the evidence, and strategize her next steps. But she was exhausted, running on sheer adrenaline and willpower. Every nerve in her body screamed at her to rest, but she knew that any hesitation would give Mason the opening he needed. As she cut through a narrow alleyway near the outskirts of town, she spotted an old, abandoned warehouse, one of many remnants of Riverside's forgotten industrial past. It loomed ahead, dark and silent, its windows shattered, walls covered in graffiti and grime. It was a relic of Riverside's prosperity, now a ghostly monument to a time that had passed long before Monica's arrival in the town. It wasn't ideal, but it would give her a chance to regroup and consider her next move. The warehouse's interior was shrouded in darkness, lit only by the faint moonlight streaming through broken skylights. She slipped inside, her footsteps echoing in the cavernous space as she moved deeper, out of sight from any prying eyes that might pass by. The stench of decay and mildew filled the air, and every shadow seemed to hold a trace of menace, but Monica pushed the unease aside. She needed to focus. She took a deep breath, attempting to calm herself, and placed her bag on a rusted metal crate. With careful hands, she retrieved the water samples and sealed them tightly, hoping the chemicals and toxins would remain stable until she could get them to a lab. Then she pulled out her camera, scrolling through the photos she'd taken of the contaminated river and the runoff from the chemical plant. Each image felt like a small victory, proof that she was one step closer to bringing Mason and his corrupt allies to justice. As she reviewed the images, a sharp, metallic clang echoed through the warehouse, freezing her in place. She held her breath, listening, every muscle in her body tense and alert. The sound was followed by footsteps heavy, purposeful, and unmistakable. Someone else was in the warehouse. Her stomach dropped as she recognized the pattern of the footsteps, the weight behind each step. It was Mason. He had found her. Monica. His voice boomed through the empty space, reverberating off the walls. You think you can keep running from me? That you can hide? I know you're in here. She swallowed, her mind racing. He was alone, or at least he sounded like he was. But she couldn't rely on assumptions. Mason had allies in the Force, men who shared his warped sense of power and justice. She scanned the warehouse, searching for any possible escape route. Her eyes settled on a narrow metal staircase leading to a platform above, partially hidden in shadow. It was risky, but it was the only option she had. Moving as quietly as possible, she slipped her bag over her shoulder and began to climb the staircase, wincing as each step creaked under her weight. She reached the platform and pressed herself against the wall, peering down at the warehouse floor below. Mason's silhouette was visible in the faint moonlight, his figure prowling through the darkness as he searched for her. His movements were deliberate, predatory, as though he were savoring the hunt. Come on out, Monica, he called, his tone laced with mockery. Let's end this little game of yours. You're only making things harder for yourself. You don't really think you can beat me, do you? Monica clenched her jaw, her fingers tightening around the strap of her bag. She was done running. Mason had terrorized this town long enough, and she wasn't about to let him win. She took a deep breath, steadying herself, and then, in one swift motion, she stepped out of the shadows and onto the edge of the platform. Mason, her voice rang out, defiant and unwavering. She watched as he froze, his head snapping up to meet her gaze. For a moment, surprise flickered across his face, quickly replaced by a twisted grin. There you are, he sneered, his voice dripping with satisfaction. I was wondering when you'd finally give up. You must be tired of running. Monica held his gaze, her expression hard as steel. I'm not the one who's been running, Mason. You're the one hiding from the truth, from justice, from everyone you've ever wronged in this town. His grin faltered, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. He took a step forward, his eyes narrowing. You really think you're some kind of hero, don't you? Coming into my town, trying to make a difference. But here's the thing, you're nobody. Just another idealistic fool who doesn't know her place. She shook her head, her gaze filled with a cold determination. This town isn't yours, Mason. It never was. You just took advantage of people's fear, but that ends tonight. He let out a bark of laughter, his expression darkening. You don't get it, do you? People like you don't make a difference. People like you end up in the ground, forgotten and useless. Monica's heart pounded, but she forced herself to stay calm. She could see the anger simmering beneath his arrogant facade, the barely restrained violence in his posture. He was close to losing control, and she intended to push him to that edge. You think I'm afraid of you? She challenged, her voice steady. You're nothing but a bully with a badge, hiding behind your uniform because you're too weak to face who you really are. The taunt struck its mark. Mason's eyes blazed with fury, and he stormed forward, his footsteps echoing through the warehouse. He was coming for her, his hands clenched into fists, his face twisted with rage. She backed up slowly, gauging the distance between them, waiting for the perfect moment. As he reached the base of the staircase, she turned and bolted across the platform, her footsteps pounding against the metal floor. She could hear him charging up the stairs behind her, each step filled with raw, unchecked aggression. She didn't look back, focusing on the open door at the far end of the platform, the only way out. But as she reached the door, she felt a hand clamp down on her shoulder, yanking her back with brutal force. She stumbled, nearly losing her balance as Mason spun her around, his grip like a vise. "Nowhere left to run," he sneered, his voice low and menacing. "It's over." She twisted, her training kicking in as she brought her knee up, driving it into his ribs. He grunted, momentarily loosening his grip, and she seized the opportunity, shoving him back with all her strength. He staggered, cursing as he nearly lost his footing, but he recovered quickly, his face contorted with rage. "You'll pay for that," he snarled, lunging at her with fists raised. Monica dodged, sidestepping his swing and countering with a swift jab to his jaw. Her knuckles connected with his cheekbone, and he stumbled, but the blow only seemed to enrage him further. He came at her again, his movements wild and frenzied, driven by a blind need to assert his dominance. They grappled on the narrow platform, their bodies crashing into the metal railing with a series of loud clangs. She could feel the adrenaline coursing through her veins, her senses heightened as she fought to stay one step ahead of him. Mason was strong, fueled by fury, but his movements were sloppy, unrestrained. She could see that he wasn't used to being challenged, to fighting someone who could match his strength and skill. For every blow he landed, she countered with precision, her training giving her the edge she needed. But her energy was waning, the exhaustion from the chase, the bruises and cuts from the previous night, and the sheer mental strain of facing him were taking their toll. She needed to end this quickly, before her body gave out. With a final surge of determination, she threw her weight forward, ramming her shoulder into his chest and sending them both crashing into the railing. The metal groaned under their combined weight, and for a split second she thought it might give way. But it held, and they both staggered back, panting and disoriented. Mason recovered first, his hand shooting out to grab her by the throat. His grip was unrelenting, cutting off her air as he shoved her back against the railing. She clawed at his hand, gasping for breath as he leaned in close, his eyes gleaming with sadistic satisfaction. "Time to say goodbye, Monica," he hissed, tightening his grip. Her vision began to blur, dark spots dancing at the edges of her sight as she struggled against his hold. Desperation surged within her, and she reached out blindly, her fingers brushing against something cold and solid. It was the wrench she'd tucked into her bag earlier, her last lifeline. With the last of her strength, she swung the wrench upward, smashing it into his temple. The impact sent a shockwave through her arm, and Mason let out a strangled yell, stumbling back as he clutched his head. She gulped in a breath, the air burning her lungs as she steadied herself, watching as he staggered, his hand pressed to his bleeding temple. The blow had disoriented him, but it hadn't taken him down. She could see the fury in his eyes, the promise of vengeance as he steadied himself, his gaze locked onto her with deadly intent. "You're dead," he spat, his voice thick with rage. "You hear me? Dead." She backed up, every instinct screaming at her to run, but she knew it was no use. He was faster, stronger, and he wouldn't stop until one of them was lying broken on the ground. But then, in the silence that followed, they both heard it, the distant sound of sirens, growing louder with each passing second. Mason's expression shifted, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face as the reality of their situation began to sink in. He'd been so consumed by his need to dominate, to control her, that he hadn't realized they'd drawn attention. Monica's heart leapt, a surge of hope breaking through her exhaustion. Help was on the way. She could see the conflict in Mason's eyes, the realization that he was running out of time. He looked at her, his face twisted with frustration and desperation. "This isn't over," he snarled, taking a step back. "You think you're safe. You're not. I'll find you. And when I do..." But before he could finish, The warehouse was flooded with flashing red and blue lights, the sirens blaring as police cars pulled up outside. Mason cursed, his fists clenching as he took one last, venomous look at her before turning and disappearing into the shadows, slipping away through a side exit. Monica sank to the ground, her body trembling with relief and exhaustion as she watched him vanish. The sound of footsteps approached, and she looked up to see uniformed officers entering the warehouse, their expressions a mix of concern and confusion. "Are you okay, ma'am?" one of them asked, kneeling beside her. She nodded, her voice hoarse. I'm fine." But as they helped her to her feet and led her out of the warehouse, she knew that this was only the beginning. Mason was still out there, and he wasn't going to let this go. He would come after her again and again until he got what he wanted, and she would be ready for him. Monica sat alone in the dimly lit room, a temporary safe house provided by one of the few allies she had managed to find within Riverside's community. The weight of exhaustion hung over her like a dark cloud, but her resolve remained unbroken. The events of the previous night replayed in her mind: the chase, the struggle, the near-death encounter with Mason, and the narrow escape. She knew she couldn't stay hidden forever. Mason wouldn't rest until he silenced her. She had become a threat to his power, and in his mind, there was only one solution. But Monica also knew that she couldn't stay in the shadows. She needed to end this once and for all. Mason had pushed her to the brink, but she wasn't about to back down. She was here for justice, not only for herself but for every person in Riverside who had suffered under his corrupt, violent rule. With the evidence she'd gathered and the physical proof of his abuse, her bruises, the injuries she'd sustained, she finally had enough to expose him. But she needed a stage, a way to bring his misdeeds into the light where even his connections couldn't protect him. She'd spent the day rallying her remaining allies, reaching out to local activists and sympathetic figures who, like her, had endured the suffocating grip of Mason's justice. They were small in number, but their voices were strong. Together they planned a public gathering, a rally where Monica would present her evidence and reveal the truth about the river's contamination and Mason's abuse of power. Nightfall came, and the abandoned town square flickered to life as people trickled in, whispers of curiosity and anticipation filling the air. Monica stood near the center, her heart pounding as she clutched the evidence in her hand: photographs, test results, witness statements. The weight of the moment bore down on her. There was no turning back now. This was her final stand, her chance to break the chains of fear that had bound Riverside for so long. As the crowd grew, Monica took the makeshift stage, her figure illuminated by the soft glow of street lamps. She cleared her throat, and silence fell over the gathering. She could see familiar faces, people she'd seen around town, people who had likely felt the sting of Mason's corruption but had been too afraid to speak up. They were here now, drawn by the promise of change, by the hope that maybe, just maybe, justice could finally be served. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I know that many of you are here because you've experienced firsthand the abuse and corruption that have plagued this town for years. I know because I felt it too. I came to Riverside to help, to expose the truth about the river's contamination, but what I found was something much darker, a system built on fear, led by men who think they're untouchable." She held up a photo of the river, its once clear waters now blackened by toxic runoff. "This is what they're doing to our town," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "This river, our lifeblood, is being poisoned every day, and they think we're too blind or too afraid to do anything about it. But we're not. Tonight, we're here to say enough is enough. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Monica took a steadying breath, lifting her gaze to scan the faces before her. In the shadows, she caught a glimpse of a familiar figure standing at the edge of the crowd, watching her with cold, unyielding eyes. It was Mason. He hadn't come alone. She could see several of his cronies flanking him, their expressions a mix of anger and arrogance. They stood with arms crossed, waiting, daring her to continue. But Monica refused to be intimidated. She raised her voice, directing her next words at him, her tone resolute. And then there are those in power, those who use their authority not to protect us, but to control us. Officer Mason and his allies have turned this town into their personal kingdom, ruling through violence and fear. They think they're invincible, but tonight we're here to show them that they're not. Mason took a step forward, his face twisted in a mocking sneer. Enough with the theatrics, Monica. You think these people care about your little crusade? They know the truth. They know what happens when you go against the law. Monica met his gaze, unflinching. No, Mason, they know what happens when they go against you, but I'm not afraid of you anymore. And neither are they. She looked out over the crowd, seeing the flicker of courage in their faces, the realization that they, too, could stand up, could fight back. Mason's grip on this town was slipping, and he knew it. The tension in the air was palpable, a powder keg waiting to explode.